Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Anna Bardone-Cone. She is a professor in the psychology and neuroscience department and researches eating disorders and body image. She has generously given us her time this evening, and so if you would help me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Aiden. Hello, good to see folks. Appreciate the invitation. Happy to talk to you about some of the work that we're doing. I will be honest, I worry I packed a little too much in, but we will see. I will skip if I need to, but we will go ahead and get started. So what I wanted to start out with is just kind of an overview of kind of what we're planning to do today. So I want to give you kind of an overview of body image and disordered eating, so what that sort of refers to in a very quick version. Talk to you a little bit about approaches to research questions in diverse, and I put in parentheses, often understudied populations. They're often one and the same. Research findings that I'm going to share come from our lab related to Black women, men, and I'm just going to tell you about a study that we are recruiting for on South Asians, talk to you about future directions, and then some resources that may be helpful. All right, so first of all, body image. Can I move this so people can see the heading or no? I can close it. Okay, cool. Thank you. Cool. Okay, great. So the main thing to understand about body image is it's a multidimensional. Now, we probably mainly think about it as this, body dissatisfaction, totally legit. And in fact, people talk about body dissatisfaction as being a normative discontent. This is a very common thing for a lot of folks, more so women than men, but men are not at all exempt from that. And certainly there's different kinds of body dissatisfaction for individuals who might be non-binary or trans. But it's just one component. So that's kind of like the feeling dissatisfied and upset at a kind of a higher level is kind of body shame, which is you also feel almost like you're flawed. But then there's also cognitive aspects of body image. So it's how you think about your body. So this one item here, overvaluation of weight and shape, is a diagnostic criterion for anorexia and bulimia. And it has to do with basically having your weight and shape influence your self-worth just too much. And one way we assess this sometimes is we ask people, okay, if you have a pie chart and you think of all the different things that influence how you feel about yourself, what portion of the pie is your weight and shape? And if people are saying, oh, it's like, 75%, that's not good. That's a problem. And then perceptual, how one's body is perceived is another aspect. So that might be kind of really just misperceiving, like you think your hips are this big, but they're not. So we won't go through all these, but I wanted to give you a sense of body image and its multidimensionality. Okay. In terms of disordered eating, we want to think about this as sort of an umbrella term that captures a bunch of different behaviors that are usually done to try to counter weight gain or maintain weight loss, things like that. So I'll just go over these. Objective binge eating. How many people here, what would people say for objective binge eating? What are some elements of that? I'll make it somewhat interactive. So what do y'all know about binge eating and objective binge eating? Yeah. Okay, so one piece of it is an excessive amount of time, more than most people would eat in a given sitting. What's a little tricky about that is how do you decide what's excessively large, objectively large? And there's some guidelines that I think all of us would agree on, but there are others that are kind of gray. And here's where place where kind of gender might come into play. I can tell you I have a teenage boy. He eats so much food, right? Like I would look at that, I'm like, oh my God, that is so much. It's not too much for him. He's a different stage. And anyhow, so that's a little tricky, but it's eating an excessive amount of food in a discrete period of time. The other key thing is loss of control. So this would be people saying like, I couldn't stop myself. Right? Once I started, I couldn't stop, or I couldn't prevent myself from having started. Fasting, that often is assessed as 24 hours without eating any food. Extreme dieting, this could be having a very limited caloric content, intake rather, and maybe skipping lots of meals. And then compensatory behaviors is like an umbrella within an umbrella term. This refers to behaviors that are done usually to try to undo eating or just, again, address weight, often not very successfully. But so this includes purging behaviors like self-induced vomiting or using laxatives, and then also compulsive exercise. We don't, as a field, have a good way of assessing compulsive exercise. Can people tell me some of the things that might make it complicated to assess if something of exercise is problematic? Yeah.
People like exercising versus other people.
Yeah. So part of it is what's your motivation, right? And if people really love it and and it's, if they're feeling ill, they don't do it. If they miss it every once in a while, they don't feel guilty. But when they're feeling good, they do it. That feels very different than I have to exercise because I ate that extra cookie or something like that. It is still kind of slippery to assess, but we need to do a better job of it. All right. So just to give you a sense of how our lab likes to approach asking research questions in diverse samples, we sort of take there's sort of two strands that we look at. One is we argue that we need to examine whether findings from predominantly white and female samples, because that's what most of the eating disorder research is focused on, if those findings apply to, for example, racial ethnic minorities, other gender identities, because we can't assume that's true. It may be true, but you have to ask the question, right? So for example, the social cultural model has been used a lot in eating disorder research. Elements of this say that there's a bunch of things that influence us, families, peers, media, and those pressures or influences can affect our tendencies to compare ourselves with others in terms of appearance. It can affect how much we internalize the importance of being thin, being muscular, and that in turn can lead to body dissatisfaction and disordered eating. So lots of support for that, but mainly in white samples. And then perfectionism is another factor that would need to be looked at in diverse samples. But then you also need to test models that include constructs and relations that may be unique to racial ethnic minorities and diverse gender identities. So basically what I'm saying here is, what is your culturally specific model that you might also want to be testing? So for example, discrimination in the culture of stress could be unique stressors that are relevant to certain racial and ethnic groups, racial socialization, racial ethnic identity, and emphasis on muscularity all might be more relevant to some groups in terms of gender identity or race and ethnicity than others. All right, so I'm going to say a little bit about Black women and body image and disordered eating. I'll talk first about disordered eating here. So there's a stereotype that Black women are protected from eating disorders and body image concerns. This is definitely getting better in terms of people realizing that's not the case, but it's still not great. So the lack of recognition, let me back up for a second. We do know that Black women are much less likely to be treated for eating disorders. Now, part of that could be something like financial barriers. That's definitely an element. But part of it is also this lack of recognition from healthcare professionals of problematic eating attitudes and behaviors. So for example, one of the studies here, an experimental study, they had case vignettes, and they all were about a woman named Mary. And the only difference was, in one case, she was a white woman. In one case, she was a Latina woman, white woman, non-Latina, Latina woman, Black woman. So these healthcare professionals were reading these vignettes, and they had to say, how would you rate them in terms of anxiety, depression, and eating problems, and would you refer them? And what they found is that it was only the Black women who were less likely to be referred compared to the white women and Latina women. Same vignette. Okay, so there's some implicit bias going on there. Also, there's other research suggesting that physicians are less likely to ask Black women about eating disorder symptoms and to provide referrals. And so that's a problem in all sorts of ways. One way that maybe isn't always thought about is when researchers look at clinical samples, well, if Black women are less likely being seen, they're less likely to be in clinical samples, which are less likely to be researched. So it has this like kind of trickle down effect that's problematic. So research tells us otherwise in terms of Black women being protected and not having these issues. Prevalence of rates of eating disorders are quite comparable across racial ethnic groups. So these are groups including Black, Latina. Things a little different for men. For women, Black, white, Latina, and Asian groups. And binge eating prevalence tends to be higher among racial ethnic minorities. In terms of body image, Black women do tend to be more satisfied with their bodies than white women. Meta-analytic work suggests that there's a small effect there, so it's not whopping, but they do tend to be feel a little better about their bodies than the other racial ethnic groups that have been assessed. When we do see a difference, it's most pronounced in college years, so most of y'all. And there's a trend for some decreased racial ethnic differences in weight dissatisfaction. So those are more similar, but still kind of differences in shape dissatisfaction. And so I just want to say a little bit about why the difference, right? So, and I don't want to make this difference so big because it is still a concern, but that is an area where there seems to be on average, still a little bit better body satisfaction for Black women. These are some thoughts that people think that it might explain that. One is kind of the definition of beauty. And Nichter et al. Did this really cool qualitative work. This is an ethnographer. And she talked with Black and white adolescent girls. And she asked them questions about, how do you know someone's beautiful? What goes into that? And the white girls were saying, oh, thin and blonde hair and all this sort of stuff. And the Black girls tended to say, it's how you carry yourself. It's how making what you have work for you. So that kind of provides a little more flexibility in terms of being able to feel attractive. There is some research suggesting that larger and more diverse body types are accepted and viewed as attractive. Media images, first of all, media images are mainly white women, very thin, so Black women may feel less like, well, that doesn't apply to me as much. So there's maybe that as a piece of it. In terms of thinking about kind of heterosexual relationships and preferences, there's some research suggesting that Black men tend to report thinking that larger sizes are a little more attractive. And then one question we had is family modeling and communication. Is there something going on differently there that might also help explain this? And so this sets up my first study that I'm going to talk about. So theoretically, Black and white young women may have different experiences of parental messages. You could think about this way. You could think about, well, given that there is generally greater acceptance of larger and more diverse body types in the Black community, maybe Black parents are less likely to pressure their daughters to lose weight. But you could also say, well, obesity and related health risks are a concern in the Black communities. And so maybe parents will exert pressure on their daughters to lose weight. So it kind of felt unclear exactly where this might go. So what our questions here were, well, how do perceptions of parental attitudes and behaviors about the body and about eating while growing up, how do those perceptions compare for the Black and white college women? And then how are those factors, modeling communication, associated with current body image? And so quickly, modeling refers to when a parent is engaging the behaviors that you observe. So if your parent is dieting, that's modeling. If your parent says you need to lose weight, that's communication. Okay? So both have been studied and have some influence. All right. This study and the next study use the same data set. So I'll just kind of describe it once. This is a sample of undergraduate females from a large Midwestern university. This was collected when I was at the University of Missouri. There were 97 Black women, 179 white women. Just some demographic data here. They did questionnaires in person. This was presented as a study of personality and eating, and they received course credit or a gift certificate for participating. So these were our measures. I'll skip to the bottom part first. Our body image measure this is a super commonly used measure in the eating disorder field, eating disorder examination questionnaire. And we use the weight concern and shape concern subscales. These tap into like dissatisfaction, overvaluation of weight and shape. So it's kind of a nice measure to capture both, well, weight and shape. And it asks about your report on the past 28 days. For perceptions of parental attitudes, we developed a measure, and I'll show you the items in a little bit, but we asked about growing up experiences. We had 6 items that talked about modeling, 6 items that talked about communication, and we split those 3 and 3 for mom and dad. We do realize that, you know, there are people who have 2 moms or 2 dads, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure who they would have selected. For example, they have 2 moms to report on, so I'm not sure about how that would have, how they would have responded in that case. All right, so let me walk you through this. What we did here is you're seeing that we're showing proportions. This is the proportion of people who said almost always or always, my mom was on a diet. Almost always or always, my dad worried about my weight. Okay, so let me see. I guess the thing I'll just point out here mainly is the pattern you'll see. So on the right-hand side, it shows the significance level, like are the proportions significantly different? And so as y'all know, 0.05 or less is considered significant. So we've got a couple really close ones and others that are definitely in the significant range. And so what we're seeing here is that it's definitely much more mothers than fathers, where we're seeing that there is a difference between the white women and the Black women. And interestingly, and kind of surprising to us, Black women reported higher percentages that their mom teased them and they felt pressure to lose weight. And that was sort of surprising to us. Does anyone have a comment on anything that surprised you based on what you see here? And again, these are proportions saying almost always or always these items are happening. Oh, yeah.
For white women, does it seem like they're big on diet, and then kind of like vice versa, the black women, more of a mother being more etc. People look back on the mom and less likely to diet themselves. So,
Yeah. So are you talking about like the first and the third row? Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? So the moms aren't dieting so much. The black women are reporting that really didn't happen so much, and yet they're reporting that they felt more pressure from their mom. That's a really interesting point. It seems like you might think those would be more aligned than they seem to be. Yep. All right. So that was at the item level. We kind of wanted to take a look. We were interested in looking at how parental modeling related to body image and parental communication related to body image. So we did, so we want to get a factor. And so what we did is we did a factor analysis of all those items. This isn't the final factor structure, but I want to show you where kind of we had to do an adjustment. All of the items that were face valid for modeling, that kind of, if you read them, you're like, yeah, that sounds like modeling. And all the items that were face valid for communication, like, oh yeah, that sounds like, parents communicating. Those fell as expected on 2 factors for the white women. For the black women, there were 2 items where that didn't really work. The bold thing basically means like that's where, like here, for example, well, I'll take this here. Grow up, my mother teased me about my weight. That really was strongly related to communication, not so much to modeling. Okay? So we found out father teasing me, that kind of didn't clearly fall on one or the other. And then this I thought was really interesting. Yeah, growing up, my mom was on a diet. In the white women, that kind of grouped together with modeling items. In the black women, that actually grouped together with the communication items. So somehow, for the black women, reporting with their mom dieted, that kind of felt more like a communication, more like a message. We don't know, is that maybe because that's less common? So when it does occur, it feels like, ooh, I need to attend to this. This is telling me something. So we're not really sure, but we thought that was interesting. So what we did is we created the factor analysis. We had to exclude those 2 items. Okay, so now we have a modeling factor, which is the mean of the items that fit under modeling, and then a communication factor, the mean on the items that relate to communication. And so these are just correlations between the modeling factor and weight and shape concern. And what you can see here is they look pretty similar for black and white women. So they're significant. And what they see is that for black women and for white women, the more they report kind of having this parental modeling, the greater their current weight and shape concern. And 5 to 4% of the variance, very similar. However, when you look at parental communication, there you see a pretty, different correlation there. And so it seems like the relationship between parental communication messages and weight and shape concern was stronger for black women than for white women. However, after we controlled for BMI, because the BMI of the black woman was, I think, an average of 24 kilograms per meter squared, and for white women was 22. And so when we controlled for that, all of a sudden the relationship between, oh shoot, this is a typo here, it should be communication, between communication and body image dropped for black women from 0.55 to 0.35, and it dropped just a little less for the white women. So what that means is, actually I'll go from the start. At the item level, what we learned is that there are higher rates of maternal dieting reported by the white women, higher rates of parental emphasis on appearance reported by the black women, but we realized we actually wish we'd phrase that item a little differently, because you can put a lot of focus on your appearance and do it as a sense of pride. Like, I want to look good and I'm going to do things and I do look good, right? Versus putting focus on your appearance because you're always thinking, oh, I need to lose weight. So this item we think is a little gray, but I think it's an interesting thing to unpack. Higher rates of maternal concerns about daughters' weight we're seeing in the black women. As the person there noted, this sort of seems surprising to be juxtaposed. For both black and white women, parental communication packed more of the punch in terms of how it's related to feeling about your body. But that stronger relationship between parental communication and body image for Black women, it kind of is due to the differences in BMI. Because once you controlled for BMI, that kind of difference went away. All right. So the second study, I'm going to pick up on talking again about parenthood in a different way. So I want to talk about perfectionism, which again is one of those strands that we know is associated with bulimic symptoms or disordered eating in mainly white women. So this perfectionist dimension that reflects high expectations set by others is associated with bulimic symptoms, and it's considered maladaptive. So this would be like others have too high expectations of me. Okay? So the idea is that feeling that others have high expectations for you can make you feel stressed, can make you feel anxious, other negative feelings, and that could motivate a sense of escape through binge eating, albeit temporarily. I realized I forgot to mention this when I talked about the eating disorder behaviors or disordered eating, that you can think of those as sometimes they're motivated by body dissatisfaction and wanting to try to change your body. That is a very strong link, body dissatisfaction and disordered eating. Obviously, lots of people have body dissatisfaction that don't have disordered eating, but it is a strong link. But it's also often used as a coping skill. And for example, binge eating can provide temporary relief. It's definitely temporary. It's not a good idea. It's obviously problematic, but that's something that might help explain why it's kind of hard to give up when people aren't engaging in it. So this is why we think high expectations from others could be negative, but it seems like perceiving that others have high expectations could also be good. And we wondered if this might especially be true for Black youth, where parental expectations, like high parental expectations, may be perceived as encouraging and guidance for living in a majority culture where they won't be content with racism, discrimination, sort of kind of setting them up, providing some racial socialization experiences to help their kids succeed. So our question was, could how you interpret high parental expectations buffer the relationship between those high expectations and bulimic symptoms? So if you think your parents have high expectations for you, but you're like, they believe in me, does that mean you're less likely to have some negative outcomes versus someone who says, that's too much, it's overwhelming? All right, so parental expectations came from the multidimensional perfectionism scale. That's a sample item. Again, perfectionism where you feel like others are setting high expectations for you, that's considered generally maladaptive, problematic. For meaning of high expectations, we had 2 items that suggest high expectations feel good, because it shows my parents are confident in me, because it shows they think I have potential. And then 2 that convey expectations feeling bad, because my parents demand too much, because my parents will inevitably be disappointed. And we coded these, so higher scores on this measure means I feel more positive about my parents' expectations. And then for bulimic symptoms, we use the bullet R. All right, so everything's significant. So you can see Black women are above the diagonal. I'll just kind of walk you all through some of this. We did find that the Black women reported higher parental expectations, and they also reported, this is the significance level, they also reported that they felt they tended to view them more positively, than the white women. They actually had lower levels of bulimic symptoms, which was a little surprising, but that was the case in the study. And then in both cases, the Black women above the diagonal, the white women below the diagonal, the correlations were as expected. So for example, the 0.34 positive means higher parental expectations are associated with higher bulimic symptoms. That's been found in the literature and mainly in white samples. And then if you tend to view high parental expectations positively, that's associated with lower bulimic symptoms. Okay. So this is kind of the descriptive piece, kind of trying to understand what these look like. And then we tested, because we were thinking of meaning of high expectations as a moderator. And so I don't know how well versed you all with moderators and mediators, but basically if something's a moderator, it's going to affect the strength of a relationship between an IV and a DV. So in this test of an interaction model, we first put in the main effects. So this was the high expectations, high parental expectations and interpretation or meaning of parental expectations. Step 2, we put in their interaction, and then the DV was bulimic symptoms. I'll show you a graph next, which will make more sense, but there was a significant interaction for Black women. but there wasn't a significant interaction for white women. So for white women, what that means is the relationship between high parental expectations and bulimic symptoms, it doesn't matter whether they interpreted them positively or negatively. That didn't have an effect. For Black women, it did. So this is only for the Black sample. So the x-axis is whether kind of they tended to view expectations positively or negatively. The DV, bulimic symptoms, is on the y-axis. And then you've got the dotted line is those who tend to have low parental expectations, low parental expectations. And the solid line is high parental expectations. So one way of thinking about this is if people the students who didn't have, Black women who basically said, no, my parents don't have terribly high expectations for me, doesn't matter if they viewed those positively or negatively, it really did not affect their level of bulimic symptoms at all. What we were most interested in, though, was those who had high parental expectations, because that is a risk factor in most of the research. And we did see this really pretty dramatic slope there that told us if you have high parental expectations and you view them positively, you're just at the same level of bulimic symptoms as those who had low parental expectations. Okay, it doesn't seem to bump up your risk. But if you have high parental expectations, high parental expectations, and you view them negatively, like it feels like too much, I'm going to disappoint them, those are the individuals who had the highest levels of bulimic symptoms. All right, so this just said what I basically said before. Black women, higher parental expectations, more positive interpretations of those, interaction only for Black women. So in terms of why racial differences in interpreting high parental expectations, I already talked a little bit about this, that we were thinking maybe we have to consider like how expectations are packaged. If they're sort of seen as an expression of faith, a form of kind of supportive cheerleading, in a minority culture with institutional disadvantage, it could feel like my parents are looking out for me, so that feels good and protective. We also think that Black families may contextualize their high expectations as such, really kind of it's part of the idea of racial socialization. This is what you need to know. And so this is why I'm having these high standards for you, because you may need to work harder than others because of the way the world is. Okay? So it can be seen as, again, that can help it be seen as more positive. The other possibility in thinking about these racial differences is maybe some individual traits influence how you interpret expectations. There's pretty significant research showing that Black women tend to have, Black individuals tend to have higher levels of self-esteem than white individuals. So maybe hearing these expectations and having higher self-esteem lets you interpret them differently, in a positive way. All right, so I won't go through all this, but I'll just say a bunch of future directions. One is definitely expanding body image assessments. So I wrote body shame. I mentioned that before, and attention to skin color and hair as part of body image. Grad student in our lab, Lauren Wash, is doing research on body shame and is also very interested in bringing in these other aspects of body image. Yes, certainly diversity with the Black populations. None of these groups are monoliths. So kind of unpacking that a bit, and maybe considering the positive messaging that might come from parents and others. And I'll just put up here very briefly, we can't look at all this, but we interviewed a subset of the Black women and looked at different themes. There were also some themes about teasing and other things, but in terms of positive ones, so for example, top one says, it made me feel confident, feel like I was the right size. I guess my mom always said I don't need to lose weight or I look fine. I thought this one was kind of interesting. Said that my parents would always tell me that I looked like my mom and how she looked when she was growing up, so I didn't worry about it. She would tell me, don't even worry about it because I know I looked the same way when I was your age and we're both beautiful. So interesting to think about, we often talk about the negative stuff and body dissatisfaction. What are the positive messages that are coming through, and what can that do? All right, I'm gonna pivot to talk about men. I forgot to say this as well to start. So I'm referring to Black women. These are people who identified as Black or African American, but I'm just using the term Black. And in terms of gender identity, the women and men in this study are presumably mainly cisgender. Some of these data, because I collected them a while ago, I didn't know or think to kind of ask, get more information. In the South Asian study that I will be briefly talking about, we are assessing gender identity in a much better way. All right, so there's definitely a misconception of eating disorders and being a rarity compared to females. This is the ratio that was just around for like decades, right? 1 to 9. So for every 9 women with an eating disorder, there's 1 guy. But more recent estimates saying, no, it's like closer to this. Okay? Binge eating disorder is a eating disorder that is pretty distributed, fairly distributed, evenly distributed. Some of the research says maybe of those with binge eating disorder, 60% are women, 40% are men. Okay, so much closer. And the National Eating Disorders Association reports, about 33% of those struggling with disordered eating are men. With body dissatisfaction, so we know it's present in men. We know it also predicts disordered eating. So it's not like, oh, they have it, but it doesn't faze them. No, it also is linked with eating pathology. But as opposed to a strong focus on weight, when you look at female samples, for men, you really need to be looking at weight and muscularity. And that's something that has been missing for a long time in the literature. The male body ideal is generally seen as high in muscularity, low in body fat. And it's referred to as a mesomorph shape, which is broad shoulders, narrow waist, and hips. And we see this lean, muscular ideal all sorts of places, right? So male models, and there's actually research saying in recent years, more and more male models are pictured without their shirts on. So kind of like calling attention to that and calling attention to like six-pack, et cetera. Sports figures, action figures, video game characters really kind of communicate this lean, muscular ideal. And this is, there are a couple of studies that actually looked at action figures over time. And what they found is that really, here's a good example, right? So here's Han Solo and Luke Skywalker back in the day, okay? Seems like those are attainable body types, perhaps, right? But this is how they've kind of evolved to sort of a type that is just not really possible. Kind of like the Barbie idea, right? If you made Barbie a life-size person, just not possible. Same with some of these action figures. And, interesting to think about how kids playing with these early on, this is part of the messaging they're getting about what maybe men should look like. So we see this happening, and it could be a contributor among many other things. All right, so we were interested in what psychosocial factors are most associated with body dissatisfaction for men. And this is a sample of, it's collected here, 165 undergrad men, online survey. This was a part of a study that was collected back when Facebook was much more common, because we have an item about Facebook, but it was part of an experimental study. And I'm just going to report on the non-experimental stuff. Okay, a lot to go through here. Mainly my point here is, so we asked about body dissatisfaction with different items. So that's a limitation of the study. We didn't have like we didn't pull them all together, but we kind of wanted to look at different things associated with weight dissatisfaction, muscular dissatisfaction. But then what we did is we looked at these different categories and we tried to pick a global measure, like global self-esteem, and something that is a little more focused, usually on appearance. So appearance contingent self-esteem, which is like, I feel good about myself if I look good, that sort of thing. Perfectionism, same thing, general measure. And then in this case, it was an interpersonal dimension, feeling like I have to present as perfect to others, sort of thing. And then social comparison, general measure, and then one's associated with comparing yourself to pictures on social media, in this case, because of the timing on Facebook. And then internalization of muscular ideals is how much do you buy into, I should be muscular, it's important to be muscular, and I need to strive for it. I need to really try to do something to be more muscular. All right, so this is just straight correlations before we pit these different concepts against each other. And the main thing I'd say to look at here is that some of the general things are just getting no play at all, right? General perfectionism, even at a bivariate level, isn't associated with any of these body dissatisfaction aspects in men. Same with general social comparison. But instead, we're seeing generally the more specific kind of constructs are showing up. And they're showing up as related. So greater appearance comparison on Facebook is associated with more dissatisfaction for weight, shape, height, musculature, and tone. I'll show you just 2 of these. What this is a regression where the DV, in this case, is the weight dissatisfaction, and we put all of these in as IVs together. So we're looking at these jointly. And what this lets you do is say, okay, these are related, and so which ones kind of account for unique variance? Which of these variables above and beyond the others really tells us something about weight dissatisfaction? And what you found here is that there were two at the very top: global self-esteem, significant, and then also appearance comparison. But all the others kind of fell out in the wash, if that makes sense. So these are the two things that might especially be relevant to weight dissatisfaction. See the exact same thing or the same pattern from musculature dissatisfaction. Again, global self-esteem, above and beyond explained muscular dissatisfaction ratings, as did appearance comparison on Facebook. And so those were the two to really to keep in mind: global self-esteem and appearance comparison with same-sex peers. They were in the expected directions. Those who had lower self-esteem or more frequent appearance comparisons had greater dissatisfaction in all these areas. And one thing I think this really argues for is the need to better understand the impact of social media, because for a while, the thought's been like, oh, men are less affected than women on social media. And some early research suggests they compare less, but my suspicion is that has changed. And so I think this speaks to needing to do a better job of understanding the social media experience. All right, this is the last research question, and I'll talk about the South Asian study and do some research and have some time for questions. So now I'm going to talk about actual eating disorders, like the diagnoses. I don't want to undercut disordered eating, super problematic on its own and as a risk factor for then coming up to an eating disorder. What we're looking at here, this is sort of an example of something that applies to women, apply to men. So we developed an operationalization of eating disorder recovery that has been shown to be valid among women. Does it apply to men? So I'll explain more about that in a second. So we recruited 36 men with a history of an eating disorder from eating disorder centers. There weren't a lot there because they're much less likely to seek treatment. And so we had to be more creative. We put up flyers in like gyms and fitness centers. We got a lot of people through that. And then various listservs. And then we have 27 men who had no eating disorder history. So this is a small sample. We're considering it's a pilot study. What they did is they did an online survey, and then they came in. They had diagnostic interviews, so we could assess if they have an eating disorder like now or in the past. And there were some other interviews, and we also measured their height and weight. I didn't say this, but they got money as a compensation for this. All right, so historically, I'll try to be brief about this, but this is something I really am interested in, so I'll try to rein it in. Historically, recovery has been defined just on physical and behavioral characteristics. So if you read the literature, they'd say, oh, we have a sample of 32 individuals recovered from anorexia. And we know they're recovered because they have a BMI of at least 18.5 or whatever it is, and they're not engaging in eating disorder behaviors. And they would stop there. And I would think, hello, what's their thinking like, right? Because you can get to a better weight and maybe stop your eating disorder behaviors. But I really want to know, are you still thinking about it all the time? Because that seems that would be a risk factor for relapse. And anecdotally, when I was seeing clients, I don't see clients now, I was working with a woman who had a history of anorexia. She would have met the physical and behavioral criteria. She was slim, but definitely like healthy weight. She reported no, binge eating, et cetera, no extreme behaviors, eating disorder behaviors at all. But she asked me in a session really earnestly, if I didn't think about food or eating, what would I think about? And I thought, oh my goodness, she's in our recovered category. Those of you who might be budding clinicians, do we want to say like, oh, you're good? That's okay if you keep thinking, no, it seems like that really affects quality of life, will be a risk factor for relapse. So I was really stunned. I kind of tried to contain it in the session there. But what our lab said is, you got to have this too. You also have to figure out some threshold that shows they're cognitively recovered. And what we did is we used this eating disorder examination questionnaire, as I mentioned before, a very commonly used measure, great norms. And we're saying, these are the subscales, and we're saying you have to be within one standard deviation of each subscale. So we're not saying you say, I have no weight concern at all. I have no eating concern at all. That's not realistic. But we just don't want people to be way out there. There are better norms on this measure for women than men. But we used a sample that of men that I'm trying to think. It pulled from all sorts of different regions, which was helpful for the sample because they were living all sorts of parts. But that is an area that will be nice to get improvement on. So full recovery is you meet this BMI criterion, you meet this behavioral criterion, you meet this cognitive criterion, and we define partial recovery as you meet the first two, but not the cognitive one. Okay? And I do want to say that it's super amazing to get from having an eating disorder to being physically and behaviorally recovered, but I think as clinicians, we want more for our clients. All right, this is like too much, so I'll just say that, well, part of what we did to try to assess the validity of this in the men was similar to what we did for women. We created, okay, fully recovered groups, partially recovered, eating disorder, and no eating disorder, and we compared them on a bunch of measures. And these were the ones, just going to show you here. All right, so the way to read this graph is, this table is, the columns refer to the recovery status. So currently have an eating disorder, partially recovered, remember that's physical and behavioral, not cognitive recovery, fully recovered, that's all three, no eating disorder history at all. Right? And then these are the measures we used. And what I'll point out, and over here it tells you like how they compare. So the very top one, the controls had lower levels of E26 is like an eating pathology measure. The controls had significantly lower levels of eating disorder symptoms than the partially recovered and the current eating disorder. We'd expect that, we'd hope that. The fully recovered people had significantly lower levels than the current eating disorders, but not significantly lower than the partial recovery. But these are very small n's, right? This is a pilot study. But if you look at the numbers on that first row, 3.70 for the controls, 5 for the full recovery, bumps to 11 for partial recovery, and 17 to eating disorder. We suspect that with a larger sample, we would have seen that significant difference. There are two categories, however, that there's no group difference. Okay? One is drive for muscularity, and the other is muscular athletic internalization. This one here, male body attitude and scale, there was a significant difference, but I want to note that that one includes both muscularity attitudes and body fat attitudes. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, good question. No, this time we grouped them all together. We do have the data on who's what, but it wasn't like just one group of eating disorders. Yeah. And maybe we can talk about that later if you have other questions about that or comments. So then I didn't show you all the data, but an operationalization of eating disorder recovery that was developed among women seems to be valid in men, but we need larger samples. And maybe considering modifications like, for example, the behaviors we assessed for did not include compulsive exercise, but it seems like that tends to be more of a component among the eating disorder presentations of men. So we should probably figure that out a little better. Oh, you know what? Did I? Oh, yeah, I didn't talk about this. So, well, okay. Body appreciation. Here's a case where higher is better. And the fully recovered and current eating disorder people did not look significantly different, and they both had significantly higher body appreciation than the other two groups. And I think that's pretty encouraging that recovery is not just decrease in body dissatisfaction, but it's actually maybe the presence of more adaptive and healthy attitudes about the body. And then we thought the non-significant differences were pretty interesting because they really focus narrowly on muscularity. So our interpretation of this was that pressures related to be muscular, which can mean as part of a male gender role expectation, may apply broadly. Doesn't matter if you've never had an eating disorder, doesn't matter if you have one now, doesn't matter if you're recovered, you still feel that pressure. Okay, so that was our sort of interpretation there. Future directions, I really think delving into social media would be important. Again, the diversity aspect. And then just, HGAPS, I know, likes assessment. We really have to do better with assessment. A lot of the eating disorder measures, the most common ones, some focus on body parts, and they include parts that just aren't as relevant to men usually, like hips. And they're less likely to include things like shoulders, that might be more relevant. A lot of the eating disorder measures focus on losing weight, like that's the goal. But for men, often the body dissatisfaction related to weight might be I weigh too little or I weigh too much. Whereas for women, often it's I weigh too much. So lack of question on steroids. So there's definitely, we're missing some people by do the assessment. And so we really should be assessing these other factors. All right, so I'll talk about this and then I think resources, and that's that good? My timing, okay. All right, okay, so this is the South Asian body image. We call it the SABI study. And we're doing this because we had a semester, actually it was one of the I think it was fall of 2020. So we all remember where we were, not here, right? Pandemic, everyone was not here. And we spent a semester reading about the eating disorder literature in diverse samples. And out of that, we developed this study. And one of the things we were so struck by was how little, very little there is on South Asians and eating disorder and body image. There is increased research on Asians as a group, but the problem is most of that research is mainly East Asian. Either they don't break it up, or when they do, it's like 5% of South Asian, and you know, so in East Asians and South Asians have different cultures and different kind of pressures and appearance pressures. So we just thought it was a huge gap in the literature. And South Asians are among the fastest growing demographic in the U.S. There, I can't remember, 7 or 8 countries that we're including in South Asian samples. It's kind of what's out in the literature. The biggest ones would be India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But there are others like Bhutan, Nepal, and Afghanistan. I'm going to forget all of them, but those are the countries that are counted as South Asian. So our goals are to provide descriptive data on a broad array of body image and disordered eating. And this, I think, is what's important because we just don't know. But it's also going to be important because a lot of the measures we're using have good psychometrics, but in primarily white samples. So we're also going to be able to provide psychometrics on these measures in a South Asian sample. We're interested in the correlates and moderators that might be related to body image and disordered eating. And again, we're trying to take this 2-strand approach. So we're asking questions about perfectionism, thin ideal internalization, self-compassion being a protective factor, all that is found support for in primarily white samples. But then we're also asking questions about a culture of stress. We'll have a measure of how many years they've been in the US. And so a culture of stress is something that's associated with disordered eating. Pressure from extended family. So for example, in a lot of South Asian cultures is the idea of the aunties who kind of maybe make comments about your body, and that's a little less common in some other groups. And then ethnic identity is another thing we're looking at. So those are our goals. Our sample is individuals of South Asian descent, 18 or older, who live in the US. So we very purposely are saying we are like all gender identities and any age. We want to avoid just young people and just females, which again has been typically the norm in eating disorder research. And our methods, we're doing an online survey with a far outreach. We've got student organizations across the US that we are contacting. Wesleyan is helping us do that. And then also community organizations. If people are interested in this, think it may be relevant for them or someone they know, feel free to email myself or the Sabi study. And so then the last things I thought I would do, I realized that it didn't say if people want, can I just questions at the end? I guess it's kind of too late. Sorry about that. We'll do questions at the end. Okay. So I just want to provide some resources. I know that was requested and I was glad it was requested. So if you have concerns about someone having an eating disorder, a lot of this is the stuff you would do if you have concerns about almost anything else about your friends and mental health or otherwise. Set aside a time to talk and really allow for that time. Don't ask them, don't say, I'm concerned when you guys have to race off to class or something like that. Really allow some time. Express concern, the whole thing about I statements, I'm worried. If you kind of observe something, you can specify that, but indicate, why you're concerned. Listen, be non-judgmental, provide resources. I think it's super helpful to say, hey, here's some places you can check out, or I'm going to send you an email with a link. Like, give them the resources so they don't have to look them up themselves. There's this cool screening tool. So you could share this with them. NEDA is the National Eating Disorders Association. And that gives you a sense of how probable, like a risk factor, I guess, for having an eating disorder diagnosis, and ask you can help. So for example, oh, no, it's not. There you go. They really are cute. They're adorable. All right. So yeah, and if people have questions about this as well as the research, I'm happy to talk with you about that. These are some resources. The National Center of Excellence for Eating Disorders is based out of UNC, and it is just a lot of resources for healthcare professionals, family members. I just put up here 3 talks that I did that are saved there. You can find them, well, you can find them via clicking on the link, but they're on this site, and they tap into some of the things we talked about here. These are all eating disorder treatment centers in the area. And then, of course, there's CAPS. And then our department has a community clinic where people can also be seen. My acknowledgements, and I think that's okay. Acknowledgements. The McNair Scholars Program at the University of Missouri. So that's where I collected the data on Black women. Clarissa Boyd was a McNair scholar that worked with me, and she really helped me kind of move in that direction. An NIH grant that helped support the recovery research. Of course, all the research study participants, all the lab members that have been involved in different ways. And then this is the group of the current lab that is working on the SABI study. Just wanted to acknowledge them as well.